This easily movable, do-it-yourself poultry tractor and utility building has many innovative features that set it apart from conventional and heavy wood-framed equivalents. The foremost feature is that it can be moved around the yard by one person with little effort. So for those living the simple life, it means no all-terrain vehicle or petrol-powered tractor is required to relocate the tractor. Another important feature is the breach-proof design created from strong wireframe construction and deployable anti-digging flaps that prevent tunneling underneath the unit. The unique landing wheel design allows the building to rest completely on the ground and then rise for transport, just by moving a few hand-operated levers. This easily portable building can be used for many other purposes as well, and it lends itself well for modifications so that you can create your own unique version of this project using the parts you have available. Listen to the entire plan before you start collecting parts to determine what modifications, if any, you may want to make. This plan encourages builders to make changes and use parts you have available. The two core components used to make the portable poultry tractor are 16-foot-long hog panels and 9 or 10-foot-long 2 3/8 or larger galvanized fence tubes. Most of this hardware can be purchased from a farm supply outlet or a larger hardware store. Decide the structure size you want to build and do some price comparisons. For this project, I purchased 10 units of 16-foot-long hog panels and 6 units of 9-foot-long galvanized fence tubes. Total cost on those items was about $400, which accounts for the bulk of the cost. The cost of those main materials isn't too bad, considering this structure will last so much longer than a wood frame version and can actually be moved around without having to shred up your yard with a huge gas-powered vehicle. Listen to the entire video series and take notes before you head out to purchase these components, as you may decide to make a larger or small frame to suit your needs. We use hog panels for many projects around our farm. They can be bent into a half circle and will completely spring back to their original shape when released. When forced into a loop as shown here, they become extremely strong and can easily support the weight of a loaded pumpkin or squash vine. Grapes will also climb the panels, and that makes for easy picking as you can walk right under the hoops. Since the length of a single fence tube is about 9.5 feet, the resulting interior height will be about 57 inches, or almost 5 feet. You could make the unit taller inside, but at the expense of less width. It's a good idea to mock up your desired loop height as shown here. You can place the hog panels in the ground using a few tent pegs or landscaping pegs, and then easily bend it into a loop and peg the other end. Be careful not to let it spring out on you though, as it will bounce right back to its original flat shape if you let it go. To weld a pair of tubes end to end, you should do some preparation for optimal weld penetration. Take an angle grinder and grind away a small amount of the edge at about 45 degrees as shown here. Doing this will make it easier to get a deep weld penetration that is free of gaps. The downside to this is that you have to be more aware of your welding current, as it will be easier to burn through the metal. You can keep alignment errors to a minimum by using alignment tricks when welding. This photo shows the two tubes to be welded sitting on a straight 4x4 post with a piece of angle iron strapped over the top to hold them in alignment. The tubing is automatically aligned by the V-shape inside the angle iron. The flat surface ensures a parallel alignment on the other side. A few good tack welds on either side of the constrained tubes will set them in place, aligned by both the angle iron and flat surface. Once you have tack welds on both sides of the joint, you can release the jig and weld the rest of the joint by rolling it as you go. Notice the nice groove between the tubes that was made by preparing the edges for welding. This is an optimal joint for good weld penetration. Continue your welding by starting on the very bottom of the joint, where the non-tack welded segment is longest. The weld should fill the gap nicely since you have prepared it with that 45-degree V-shape earlier. Welding does take practice, but do remember that a strong weld does not always have to be pretty. A flap disc on your angle grinder can take away slag and spatter if you care enough to clean up your work after. Here are the two side rail tubes after welding them end to end using the simple alignment jig method. They turned out extremely straight. Both are the same. These two 19-foot-long rails now define the total length of the portable pen. You could probably get away with 3 tubes welded end to end for a 28.5-foot-long tractor, but it would probably be at the limit of weight for the single front wheel design shown here. Fish mouthing a tube is the process of cutting 2 semicircles from the end of the tube so that it fits perpendicular against the crossing tube. The circle to be cut from the tube needs to be the same diameter as the mating tube. So find a round object of the proper size and then trace out your fish mouth cut lines about 1 inch from the end. To cut out the fish mouth, start by using a zip disc to rough out the cut and then finish it up with a standard metal grinding disc. Place the fish mouth against the mating tube to check your work. When the tube sits together at 90 degrees with no large gaps on either side, then you are ready for welding. A proper fish mouth cut should mate with the crossing tube like this, leaving no more than a 1/8 inch gap at any place. You don't have to be perfect, of course, since weld metal will fill up any inconsistencies in the joint. Too large of a gap, though, may take several weld passes to fill in, which could lead to distortion of your 90-degree angles. There are 2 ways to check the alignment of a square frame. Using a 90-degree square in the corner like this is one method. The only problem with this method is that the square is only 6 inches long, so it may look perfectly square here, but it could be out by a few degrees all the way at the other end of the tube. A second, more accurate way to check a square or rectangular frame is to do your best with the square and then measure the corners diagonally to see that they are even. Imagine drawing an X through your square. A perfect square will be equal from corner to corner on both crossing measurements taken. Once you have your frame sitting in good alignment, both square and on parallel ground, make a decent-sized tack weld on the top of the joint as shown here. Since I normally work on uneven ground, I also had to shim my frame level using buckets, bricks, wood, and whatever else was laying around the farm. A bubble level is your friend here. Remember that galvanized steel and other metals emits toxic fumes while being welded. Only weld outdoors and either use a ventilator or hold your breath during the weld process. Welding in place in all positions is much more challenging, but for now you can still weld as much as possible on the top of the joints in all 4 corners, and then flip the entire frame over to weld the other side. Once you have more than an inch of weld on the top of the joint, continue to check your alignment using the corner-to-corner measuring trick shown in the next photo. It is still possible to force the frame back into square with a small amount in each corner welded, but it'll be impossible once you get as far as what is shown in this image. Once you are certain that your frame is decently square and all the tubes are level to one another, you can weld as much of the joint as possible in this position. To help minimize distortion due to weld heat, weld the joints in the sequence shown here, which will make distortions oppose each other rather than accumulate. It takes a bit of acrobatics to flip over the huge frame, but once you have the top sections of the joint welded, it will be stiff enough to handle without causing any misalignment. Once flipped, you can now weld the other side of the joint to complete the entire weld as shown here. Notice the heat-affected zone that extends half an inch away from the weld. This discoloration is due to having burnt off the zinc coating that protects the steel from rusting. These areas will need to be painted to protect them again. The retractable landing gear can be built using whatever scrap parts you have at your disposal. Wheelbarrow wheels, trailer wheels, and BMX bicycle wheels, as I show here, will work. Look ahead so you can understand the goal of the landing gear, which is to simply jack up the frame a few inches when it needs to be moved. I decided to hack up some old bicycle cranks to make my rear landing gear, but feel free to use whatever scrap bits of tubing and hardware you have laying around. Absolutely nothing about this project is critical. The goal is to do it on the cheap with recycled parts. If you choose to use bicycle wheels for this project and fasten them using only one end of the axle like I did, you will need to choose a 20-inch diameter BMX wheel that has a 14mm diameter axle. These wheels are made for serious strength. When you compare one to a typical bicycle hub as shown here, you can see that they are substantially more robust. I used new BMX wheels purchased from a bike shop since they were only $30 per wheel complete with tires. The number of spokes is not important, but the axle diameter is. Ask for 20-inch BMX wheels with 14mm axles if you plan to go this route. Other good options for wheels are wheelbarrow, small trailer, ATV, or yard mower wheels. The reason I chose the single-piece bicycle crank arms and the 14mm axle BMX wheels is because they work together with no modifications as shown here. I shifted the axle to one side of the hub and then bolted the wheel right to the hole in the crank arm where the bicycle pedal would normally fit. This was a perfect and simple solution. If you want to learn about using bicycle parts for your projects, check out the many tutorials on chopzone.com. The cranks are fastened to a bicycle frame by these 2 bearing tubes that are called bottom brackets. The bearing hardware is fit into the bottom brackets, and then the cranks are installed into the bearings. The bottom brackets shown here were cut from some old kids' bikes and then cleaned up with an angle grinder for reuse here. If you want more info on bicycle frame recycling, check out the complete tutorial on chopzone.com called Bicycle Frame Chopping. Here is one completed bicycle crank assembly, including the bottom bracket, which can now be repurposed in this project and many others. I like using bike parts in my designs because they are inexpensive, easy to repair, and can be easily welded to just about anything. When old bikes are tossed away, often these parts are in perfect working order, only requiring a bit of cleanup and a regreasing. To make use of the bicycle wheels and cranks, I cut a 6.5-inch long piece of 1.5-inch square tubing to fasten the bottom bracket shell to the frame. This length was chosen as it places the frame about 5 inches off the ground in the lifted position for moving around. When building something using random scrap you have laying around, like I did here, it's a good idea to test fit everything or mock up the design to determine optimal lengths and placements for your components. Any type of 1 to 2-inch thin-walled tubing will work here, but I just happen to have these units in my cutoffs bin. The square tube is shown here welded to the bottom bracket shell. When welding a bottom bracket shell, it's a good idea to have the bearing cups inserted. This will help reduce the tendency of the shell to distort as welding stresses try to force it out of round. Here is my test fit of the rear landing wheel assembly. In this position, the wheel is as far down as it can go, which would lift the frame about 6 inches from the ground, which is more than enough. Since the BMX wheel be held on a slight side angle by a locking chain, the end result will be about 5 inches of lift, which is also fine for a relatively flat yard. If your yard is very uneven, then you may want to add more ground clearance so your frame does not bottom out over a hill. Keep in mind, though, that the higher you try to lift the frame, the more effort it will be. The rear wheels are easy because there are 2 of them, but the front wheel has to lift its half of the pen completely alone. Because the bicycle cranks can spin completely around, the wheel can move into a position that places the frame directly on the ground, which is the goal for parked or landed mode. Later, I will cut the inner crank arm off and add a new handle, because in this configuration, it'll collide with the back screen wall that will eventually be installed. Here is the frame taken off the buckets and placed directly on the ground so you can see the position of the wheel and crank arm in fully landed mode. You can also see that I welded a chain from the crank arm to the frame, which will lock the wheel when in lift mode. To get the optimal chain length, make a rough guess and then cut a bit more than you require. Shorten as required. I also removed the inner crank arm by cutting it with a zip disc. Here is fully lifted mode shown. The frame is now held approximately 5 inches off the ground. The wheel is locked in this position by the chain that is welded to the crank arm and the frame. The chain is able to hold the wheel securely in this position because the weight of the frame is placing tension on the chain. The front landing gear is a bit more complex since it has to lift and steer the entire unit, but again, I just built it using whatever junk I had laying around. Just as the rear landing gear, the goal is a 5 or 6 inch lift from the ground, but now we also need to steer the unit and have a place to push. Shown here is a BMX fork and matching head tube hacked from a kid's bike I found at the dump. The forks were designed to fit a 10mm bicycle axle, but since I had purchased 3 wheels with the more robust 14mm axles, I hacked the dropouts out to the larger size using a zip disc. Once again, feel free to use whatever parts and wheel types you have available. Just like the bottom bracket, the head tube is hacked from a scrap bike and then cleaned up for reuse here. There are plenty of tutorials showing how head tubes and bike forks work on our tutorials section at chopzone.com, so check them out if you are not normally a bike parts hacker. A head tube consists of the actual head tube shell, 2 bearing cups, 2 bearings, and some threaded hardware to hold it all together. It's best to take all of this parts from the same bike so you know they will work well together. This is a full bicycle fork set in head tube ready to be made into something new. You don't actually have to match the forks with the wheel either, just make sure that the wheel is not too large of a diameter for whatever forks you have. BMX forks like this are also much more robust than thin road bike forks, so they are the better choice. Depending on your final design, the forks and wheel may be asked to carry 200 pounds or more. To allow the front landing gear to both lift and steer, the head tube must pivot somehow, which you can see in the Portapen demo video. The small part shown here was hacked from an old exercise stepping machine, and it includes a square tube, a bearing tube, and a set of brass bushings with a half-inch internal diameter. This bit of scrap seemed perfect to allow the head tube to move fore and aft, allowing it to lift or lower the frame. You really don't need to use bushing or bearings for this, but I just had the part laying around. If I didn't have this part, I would have just used a bolt right through a bit of square tube without any bushing at all. Here are two pieces of 1/4-inch thick flat bar welded to a bolt that is placed through the bushings. More junk hacked from the old exercise machine made to fit this project. When you are repurposing junk from your scrap bin like this, it's best to test fit or tack weld thing together for a mock fit and then cut them down as required. I build just about everything like this. Cut, test, fix, and then worry about measurements if it all works out. Never fully weld anything until it passes a mock-up test. I tack welded my front landing gear hack to the frame using a length of the fence tubing, making small adjustments in the angle and length until the wheel would hold the frame off the ground at the 6-inch desired height. Besides the 6-inch ground clearance, the only other thing that matters is that the head tube is angled slightly forward, just as on a bike frame, and that the tire won't rub on the frame when in the lifted position. There are so many ways you could make this work using various bits of tubing and wheel types, so let your imagination loose and find a good home for those scrap parts. To make a rear landing gear lifting handle, I cut an old mountain bike handlebar in half and then welded it to the outside crank arm as shown here. Any tubing would work for this, but the handlebar allowed me to use standard bicycle handle grips, giving the final project a bit more of a refined look. When working out the position for your landing gear lever, try the wheel in both positions so you can see what is most comfortable for you. The position of the 16-inch long handlebar segment shown here worked perfectly in this specific design. The wheel is shown here in the lifted position. This is what I eventually came up with for a front landing system that can lock into place. Built completely from bicycle parts and scrap tubing, the landing gear allows the front of the frame to be lifted 6 inches off the ground and then locked into place. The bicycle handlebars are then used to push and steer the vehicle around the yard. This system worked very well. This system worked well for the size of frame I am using, but if I were to make a larger frame, this single front wheel design may not be strong enough to handle the weight. At that point, a dual front wheel system may be better, or a larger, heavier front wheel setup using a wheelbarrow or trailer wheel and 2-inch tubing for front forks. The locking system is very simple. It's a bit of flat bar with a hole drilled into it so that a pin can fall through the hole to lock the pivoting head tube from moving. The open chain link that is welded above the assembly is just there to hold the lever when it is in the open position. There is nothing at all critical about the size, shape, or parts used here. Just recycle whatever scrap you have. I use these same bits to make the door latches and locks shown later as well, consisting of short lengths of half-inch tubing with bolts or steel rod that fits inside the tubing. This photo shows how the locking pin drops into the hole drilled through the piece of flat bar that is connected to the pivoting section of the head tube. This system works much the same way as a gym locker door, where 2 holes align for your lock. In this case, the lock is that pin that rides up and down in the small hollow tube. Here is the pivoting front end shown in the parked position with the frame on the ground. You can see the hole in the flat bar that the pin captures in order to lock the unit in place. The locking pin is also cradled in that chain link segment so that the pin is not in your way when you go to push the wheel into the lock position, a job that requires both hands. Once you get your front landing system working the way you want, weld it to the frame. Although this step is optional, it does make the completed unit look much nicer and will prevent rain or small critters from taking up residence inside the frame. These rough-cut sheet metal circles will be welded to the open ends of the frame tubing to cap them off. Any thin-gauge sheet metal will work for this. Once you grind the discs into the approximate size, drill small holes in each one to allow moisture to escape. Completely sealed tubes will actually rust out from the inside quicker than those without any caps, so this breathing hole will prevent that issue. This photo shows the completed base frame, which now has all of the bare metal sections painted. Every area where you weld the galvanized tubing will need painting since the protective zinc is burned away. All bare metal components should also be painted since this is an outdoor project. Oil-based exterior paint is best for this work. Here is another view of the front landing gear hardware after painting it. This certainly isn't my best paint job, but I did put it on thick so that I wouldn't have to repaint it every year, and I am on year 5 now with no signs of rust. The rear landing gear supports and surrounding exposed metal segments are also painted. Avoid getting paint in the bearing cups, or your bearings will not spin correctly when assembled. The front push handle shown here is for leveraging the wheel up and down. It should be at least 20 inches long to make it easier to lift the weight of the unit. I made the straight section from some scrap 3/4 inch conduit and the gusset tubes from the rear sections of an old bike frame. You will absolutely require the gusset tubes, as the force required to lift up the unit will cause the joint at the base of the forks to bend. When you need to create something strong like this, always think in triangles. Just look at how a bicycle frame is made. Here is the completed and painted frame, ready to roll around the yard. The only thing missing are the extra supports I added to the front, which can be seen in the next few steps. Here is the painted front landing gear shown in the lifted position, secured in place by the locking pin. Bicycle handle grips are added to give the unit a more finished look and to keep rain and bugs out of the open tubing. The front wheel is identical to the two rear wheels, which are 20-inch BMX wheels with robust 14mm axles. The front end in the park position, placing the frame flat on the ground. This design also keeps the handlebars out of the inside perimeter of the frame, which will be important once you start adding the screen walls. I have the handlebars installed in reverse because the single front wheel is actually the rear of the vehicle. You will always be pushing the handlebars, moving the vehicle forward with the two wheels in the front. This is a rear steer configuration. The rear landing wheel system also gets a thick paint job and handle grips to seal off the open tubing. All bearings are packed with grease as well and should remain maintenance-free for life. Here is another shot of the rear wheel in the landed position, showing the orientation of the handlebar. The handlebar does not touch the ground in either position and is clear of any part of the interior screen frame. In the raised position, the chain is pulled tight and the wheel cannot flop over when pushing the unit forward. You can easily adjust the chain later if you want to add a little more height to your lift if you find that your yard is more uneven than accounted for. I use hog panel in many projects around our farm. One thing you will find is that they are somewhat annoying to weld. The panels are made from small diameter rod that is very heavily galvanized, so the arc will pop and hiss, requiring multiple passes to get it right. You can weld them, but I have found a much better way of fastening and linking these panels is by using chain links. This is how I connected the hog panels to the frame side wall tubes. The half link is welded to the inside of the frame tube so that it holds the panel in place. You only require one link placed about 4 panel segments apart or at about 20 inches from the next link. This system allows the panel to arc into its natural round shape as well, as it can pivot if required. To stop the panel from moving side to side, the end links butt up against the last horizontal rod as shown here. With the initial round panel installed at the rear of the frame, you can now work out the size and shape for the rear wall. The rear wall will be made by cutting up a panel to fill the open end, be either welding it to the round panel or by using the chain link method to join them. Either way, you need to create a half-circular panel for the back wall from one or more cut panels. The easiest way I have found to do this is to lay the sections you are going to cut up against the back as shown here, and then trim them in place using a zip disc or bolt cutters. The rounded panel will settle into the perfect arc all on its own, so by using it as a guide, you can be sure that the back wall will fit perfectly. Here is the back wall fully installed. You may have to chop more than one panel up to fill in the entire back wall, but that isn't a problem since you will require small sections of panel later to make the doors and front section. I didn't have much waste when I was done. The base of the back wall is also fastened to the rear frame rail using the half-link method, with 8 or so links hold it to the inside of the frame. At this point, the structure is fairly rigid, so you can continue adding the side walls until you end up at the front of the frame. The next panel will be easy since you now have the previous round panel as a guide. Repeat the process of clamping the panel in place for fastening with the half links. To join the panels edge to edge, you can weld them like I did, or use chain links or stainless fence wire. Fence wire is probably the easiest method to use as it requires no welding or cutting. My frame required 3 full-side wall panels, leaving a section that would require slightly less than half a panel to complete. If I started over again, I would probably have made the side frame tubes long enough so that I used 4 full panels and didn't need to cut one. Of course, the longer the frame, the more you have to worry about bottoming out on an uneven yard. The ability to move this around the yard easily was the only way I could finish my welding, since my cables only reached about 10 feet out of my welding shack. I had to weld one side at a time and then turn the entire unit around to get to the other side. I was impressed by how narrow of a turning circle that I needed, thanks to the ability of the front wheel to turn even more than 90 degrees. The interior section came together very quickly, and the unit only needed a front wall to be completed. I took the design further and added in interior roosting sections so the turkeys or chickens could have a nighttime home. But this is optional depending on the purpose of your project. In this state, it would make a great movable greenhouse or shade house with the correct coverings. The last segment of sidewall only required a small section of panel to be cut. Unfortunately, I ended up with rods at the end to join, rather than a full-length edge. I didn't consider the panels when making the frame, as I simply joined the tubes together at their full length. The front wall is built using the same fit and trim technique as the rear wall, but this time, you also have to consider some type of door in order to get into your structure. A simple door frame can be easily made by placing to lengths of 3/4-inch electrical conduit from the base frame to the top and then adding hinges. The size and placement of the door is totally up to you, but it does make sense to have it to the side of the steering system. Once you have cut the 2 door frame tubes, weld them in place, and then cut one more section of the 3/4-inch conduit for the top of the door frame. I used some of the leftover hog panel bits to fill in the open section above the top of the door frame, just to add some extra rigidity and to make the final product look completed. To fasten the top of the door frame tubes to the hog panel, crush the ends flat using vice grips so that you can weld them directly to the small panel rods as shown here. Notice the distortion that happens to the hog panel due to the welding heat. This isn't an issue as you can bang the panel with a hammer to remove the sagging. Conduit is also galvanized tubing, so remember to not inhale the fumes. I had plenty of leftover hog panel to cut out this door section shown here. If you don't have a large enough section for the door, complete the front wall next, and then you probably will. Door hinges and locks are shown later in the video. I decided to reinforce the single tube that had to carry half of the entire weight when lifting the front end. I used 2 more sections of the 1.5-inch square tubing since I had some to spare. The 2 new support tubes are 15 inches long. Notice the usual fish mouth cuts made to fit to the round frame, as well as the sections of paint I had to remove to make a good weld. If you intend to raise poultry in the tractor, then you will want to create an enclosed roosting section. I decided to make my roosting area out of last rear quarter section of the interior, which seemed about right for the number of chickens that would inhabit the unit. An interior door can be made using the exact same method as shown for the exterior door, using 3/4-inch conduit to make the frame. One thing you do have to add, though, is a tube that spans the entire width in order to support the door frame. This tube should be at least a 1-inch conduit or 1 1/4-inch fence top rail tube so that it doesn't bend from the weight of the door. The top side tubes of the interior door frame are also crushed together so that they can be easily welded to the crossing hog panel wireframe. Weld the crushed tubing completely across so that no rain can get into the tubing. Small bits of leftover hog panel are again cut up to add support above the top door frame tube. To keep the final weight to a manageable level, I decided to make the interior walls from coroplast, which is a lightweight and weatherproof corrugated plastic often used to make signs. To hold the 4x8 plastic sheets to the inside of the structure, they need to be held at the bottom and then forced up against the inside of the panels to conform to the round shape. Rather than popping wire through the panels and sewing them to the wire frame, I found these plastic strips at the hardware store. To make this structure more versatile, I wanted the ability to remove the interior walls when required, so I decided to fasten the plastic strips to the bottom using hooks made from bending some 1-inch flat bar into L shapes. To bend flat bar easily, run a zip disc lightly along your mark line to create a score line and then bend them with a hammer and a vise. The L-shaped hooks are placed along the bottom rail at about 2 feet apart to hold the plastic trim channel. Since the coroplast panels will be forced fit to the side walls, everything will naturally stay in place, yet allow easy removal when required. Here is one of the support rails held in place by the L-shaped hooks. I could now use either coroplast panels or wood panels to make the nesting area walls, although wood panels need to be painted in order to withstand the elements. The entire nesting interior perimeter will require these hooks and trim channels in order to hold the interior walls in place. The interior space is about 6 feet long and 9 feet wide, so these plastic rails work out nicely as they are 8 feet long. The 4 by 8 Coroplast sheet will fit up against the interior wall as shown here, placed into the plastic rail that is being held in place by the L-shaped hooks. The plan will be to run a center top plastic rail to capture the Coroplast sheets on both sides and then pop them in place so they are forced towards the round interior of the building. This will work if they are cut a little too long, as it makes a buckle effect that will press them up against the hog panel. The roost area door will be made from the same 3/4-inch conduit as the frame, just slightly smaller so that it will fit into the outer frame. This thin-walled metal tubing is very light and when welded into a frame is also fairly rigid, so it is a good choice for a job like this. The door hinge is just another half-chain link welded to the door's frame so that it can sit on a pin that is welded to the outer frame as shown here. The pin is a 1-inch piece of the hog panel screen and it is welded to a small length of flat bar to place it about 1/2 inch away from the frame tubing. The door can now just drop in and out of the hinges for easy removal. Using the leftover bits of hog panel, it's easy to make a custom door to suit your requirements. The door shown here also includes a smaller 2-foot with by 2-foot high trapdoor so we can let the chickens come and go from the nesting area at night. During a bad storm, the trapdoor can be closed so the birds stay put where it is dry in the enclosed section. The trapdoor locking system works exactly the same way as the locking mechanism on the front landing gear, with a pin that settles into a hole guided by a small hollow tube. In this case, the pin is a section of the hog panel rod with the head of a carriage bolt welded to it so it can be easily moved by hand. Once again, a pin and plate locking system is made for the interior main door using scrap that was laying around. The receiving plate with the hole in this case is a small length of 1-inch angle iron. When you are building projects around the farm, your metal scrap pile can never be large enough. Practically anything you can weld can be used for various projects. The poultry tractor is nearly complete now, with only some of the small interior work to be completed. At this point, I still had 2 full hog panels left over, so I decided to deal with the problem of predators that might try to dig under the unit. It doesn't matter how heavy or secure your poultry tractor might be if a hungry fox or marten decides to spend half an hour tunneling under the frame. The next few steps detail the creation of anti-digging flap doors. Here is a shot of the completed interior, including the double door. The L-shaped latch midway up the Coroplast panel allows the hatch to be opened and then held in the open position. It's built the same way as all of the other door locks and latches, using hog panel rod and some hollow 1/2-inch tube for the rod to slide into. An insecure pen full of poultry is a predator's dream come true, especially for those that could easily dig under the frame. The anti-digging flaps are very easy to add. They fold up along the sides of the unit when it comes time to relocate. To add the flaps, cut a few more chain half links and weld them to the outside of the main frame tubes. The added panels will now fold up like they are on hinges. If you watch the demo video, you can also see that I have also added smaller hinged panels to the ends of the main hinge panels, creating a system that allows all of the panels to unfold around the entire perimeter of the unit, so there is no section large enough for a fox-sized animal to tunnel under. You can add any number of hinge panels to the frame or to other panels by cutting the required hog panels to size and then linking them with the chain links. The Coroplast panels are pressed up against the interior of the structure, held in place by the buckling forces between the 2 plastic rails that secure them at each end. One single plastic rail is placed centrally along the roof to capture both panels at the top as shown here. The plastic rail is stitched to the hog panels using fence wire. Drill 2 small holes on each side of a crossing hog panel rod, loop some fence wire through and then twist the ends together like a twist tie. Filling in the back wall with the Coroplast sheets involves cutting the segments to conform to the circular shape of the rear wall. Start with the largest center section and then use the structure as a guide to draw the required cutting line on the sheet while it is held in place. The sheets can be fastened to the hog panel by sewing chicken wire through the sheet and around the hog panel rods. Remember to paint all of the exposed steel bits, including the heat-affected zone, around the galvanized tubing where the zinc has been burnt away. With a good heavy coat of oil-based paint, you should be fine for many years. If you decide to use wood panel anywhere in your interior design, here is an easy method of fastening to the hog panel rods. Place some strapping around the hog panel rod, and then force it into a 90-degree twist so that it is flat with the panel. Add a wood screw to the smaller hole in the strapping. Now the wood panel is secured. This system works well for hanging feeders and other objects to the interior walls as well. Here is the completed Portapin poultry tractor. It went from portable mode to fully secured mode, shown here in less than a minute. With the anti-digging flaps deployed, the outer perimeter is protected an extra 3 feet all around, and there isn't one spot with an open ground area larger than the hog panel screen openings. Predators will walk up to the edge of the frame looking for a place to dig, not understanding that they would have to start digging all the way where the deployed panels start. In the few years we have been using this unit, no animal has even bothered to try digging in beyond a few swipes at the screen. I also added hardware cloth iron wire mesh with half-inch spacing to the lower half of the unit so that curious predators like fox wouldn't be tempted to reach through the screen for a swipe. The screen also proved useful for raising chicks, as they can walk right through the large hog panel screen. Here is the completed interior. When relocating the unit, birds are moved out of the roosting area, and then the trap door is locked closed. This way, you can ensure that they are walking along at the pace you move the vehicle and not being bumped or stuck under the frame. This worked extremely well, and they always tend to follow along, staying in the center of the room. To get into the roosting area, you walk through the human door. This door can also be lifted off the hinges for easy removal at any time. Even a small yard works well if you can find at least 6 or 7 places to move the tractor to throughout the week. By the end of the week, the grass in the first area usually grows back, so the birds are always enjoying fresh grazing area, while at the same time staying safe from most predators and any harsh weather. Here is a simple foldable and portable roost that can be made from 2x4 lumber and a few door hinges. We raised turkeys and some of them grew to over 40 pounds each, so the 2x4 construction was certainly warranted. For chickens, you could use smaller lumber such as 2x3 or 2x2. I also used treated wood so that we could take the roost out and hose it down for cleaning. The portable roost unfolds to create a sturdy place for the birds to rest at night. There was room for 12 large turkeys on this roost. The roost is strong enough that I can sit on one of the rails, which is good since 4 large turkeys can top 120 pounds per rail. When the weather turns bad for days on end, you can secure a tarp over the entire unit like this, creating an instant weatherproof interior. This tarp also worked well as a heat shield during the peak summer months by rolling it up on the shady side for fresh air, while it reflected the sun on the hot side. A portable covered building like this can be used for a lot of other purposes as well, even a makeshift garage for working on small machines. We also made several hanging feeders and other implements such as shelves, fans, and lights. It's very easy to hang anything from the interior just by getting a hook and placing it over one of the horizontal hog panel rails. The turkeys took to their new home right away, enjoying the fresh grass under their feet, which would last them about 2 days at a time. The roosting area and portable roost worked out well, and they habitually made their way through the trapdoor every night as soon as the sun set. We watched from the house as various foxes tested for vulnerable areas. After a few futile attempts and scoping around the tractor, they always gave up. We also used this portable building as a mini greenhouse and cold frame to start plants when there was still frost on the ground. An insulating wall made of straw bales protected the plants from the elements. Black breathable landscape cloth was also laid down on the ground to suppress weeds and absorb the sun's heat. We set up this system in early May, when temperatures often dip below the freezing mark. We placed a plastic sheet over the open top of the straw bale perimeter to create a simple greenhouse that would trap the heat and moisture inside, while at the same time heating the ground so that plants could use the stored heat at night. This was a mini solar battery. The plastic is wrapped around a long 2x4 and stapled in place to stretch around the structure, but also to allow for easy roll-up access inside the bale walls. The mini greenhouse system worked well, so we came up with a more convenient and permanent method of adjusting the amount of trapped UV and heat inside the straw bale interior. These plastic sheeted door frames made the unit work more like a cold frame rather than a greenhouse. But the idea was really the same. Trap the UV and heat inside an insulated structure with some ability to regulate the heat. Here are the 2 cold frame doors installed in the mini greenhouse. Now plants can be placed on either side so that heat can be regulated by raising or lowering the doors during the day. Expanding on the early growing and plant acclimating idea, the rear interior section is covered with a shade cloth. Plants that have been raised indoors under heat lamps can be acclimated to the real world in a shaded area with minimal wind and out of the midday scorching sun. So the poultry tractor also serves as a mini greenhouse and a plant acclimating shade house. It's truly a multi-purpose structure. No doubt you will find many other uses for this versatile and easily portable building on wheels, but the primary purpose will remain as a poultry tractor that keeps birds on fresh grass and out of the grasp of predators. We hope you enjoy building and using your own version of this project and would love to see your build photos and completed work in our Builders Forum and Gallery someday. If you are into DIY projects of all kinds, then please check out our other DIY plans on chopzone.com. You will find a more detailed and printable version of this project, along with 40 other fun-to-build DIY projects. Thanks for watching. Now sit back and enjoy a tour of our portable poultry tractor.